Hey everyone! So today's video is on Tagore and on Sadhana, and this chapter is particularly important because this is called the relation of the individual to the universe. So it not only connects to the video I made on the self, and if anybody remembers that I talked about how the self is constantly seeking that which is outside of itself, that's bigger than itself, the consummation of the self in the universe. So essentially this chapter tries to distinguish between Western thought and ancient Indian thought, and how this kind of thinking, this seeking of something bigger than yourself, is deeply imbued in our ancient texts, while in the West we have a very different worldview of our relation to nature. So I'm just going to start off with this chapter. Right. So he's talking about the civilization of Greece, and he's saying that it was nurtured within the city walls. And in fact, all modern civilizations have their cradles in brick and mortar. So they set up the principle of divide and rule in our mental outlook, which begets in us a habit of securing all our conquests by fortifying them and separating them from one another. We divide nation and nation, knowledge and knowledge, man and nature. It breeds in us a strong suspicion of whatever is beyond the barriers we have built, and everything has to fight hard for its entrance into our recognition. So here, when he talks about a suspicion of that which lies beyond the barriers we have built, and so he's talking about like this kind of a false enemy that has been created because of these boundaries that are meant to protect us. So anything that lies outside the boundary is an enemy, a threat. No, and it's a psychological thing. You don't try to understand what lies outside the boundary. All you know is that if it's outside the boundary, it's a threat. So it's also referring to a kind of echo chamber, that this is the information you receive, and within this chamber of information, you don't seek what is outside of it because you find safety and comfort within it. Such a life, it may be thought, tends to have the effect of dulling human intelligence and dwarfing the incentives to progress. Then he's comparing it to, okay, when the first Aryan invaders appeared in India, it was a vast land of forests, and the newcomers rapidly took advantage of them. These forests afforded them shelter from the fierce heat of the sun and the ravages of tropical storms, pastures for cattle, fuel for sacrificial fire, and materials for building cottages. And the different Aryan clans with their patriarchal heads settled in the different forest tracts, which had some special advantage of natural protection and food and water in plenty. So now he's talking about invaders who sought shelter in forests, and if you can sense from his language, he's talking about how these Aryan invaders used the forest for their comforts. That the forest wasn't seen as its own living entity, but the forest was seen as a subservient, a slave almost. Well, something that is meant to serve the purpose of man. But he's saying that in India, it was in the forests that our civilization had its birth, and it took a distinct character from this origin and environment. It was surrounded by the vast life of nature, was fed and clothed by her, and had the closest and most constant intercourse with her varying aspects. And now listen to the language in which he describes how India had a relationship with nature, how she was embraced by nature and clothed by her, and it was her most constant companion. Do you see the difference? So then he's talking about how this kind of a life, it may be thought, tends to have the effect of dulling human intelligence and dwarfing the incentives to progress by lowering the standards of existence. But in ancient India, we find that the circumstances of forest life did not overcome man's mind and did not enfeeble the current of his energies, but only gave it a particular direction. Having been in constant contact with the living growth of nature, his mind was free from the desire to extend his dominion by erecting boundary walls around his acquisitions. His aim was never to acquire, but to realize, to enlarge his consciousness by growing with and growing into his surroundings. He felt that truth is all comprehensive, that there is no such thing as absolute isolation in existence, and the only way of attaining truth is through interpenetration of our being into all objects. To realize this great harmony between man's spirit and the spirit of the world was the endeavor of the forest dwelling sages of ancient India. So, exactly, it is believed, if anybody knows about the white man's burden of civilizing the brute, so that's the way all those who were forest dwellers were seen. They were seen as brutish, of lower intelligence, but Tagore is saying actually it was the contrary, because in the forest they found respite. They found the space to be at one not only with themselves but with nature. They understood what it really means to be connected, and rather than going back to their most basic, most animalistic nature, they actually realized their higher selves. Yeah. So, but even in in the later days, there came a time when these primeval forests gave way to cultivated fields and wealthy cities sprang up on all sides. Mighty kingdoms were established, which had communications with all the great powers of the world. But even in the heyday of its material prosperity, the heart of India ever looked back with adoration upon the early ideal of strenuous self-realization and the dignity of the simple life of the forest hermitage, and drew its best inspiration from the wisdom stored there. So he's talking about how the real wealth and the real love lies not in the glory of fortresses, but lies in the simplicity of forests, of just being with nature. The West seems to take pride in thinking that it is subduing nature, as if we are living in a hostile world where we have to wrest everything we want from an unwilling and alien arrangement of things. This sentiment is a product of a city wall habit and a training of mind. For in the city wall life, man naturally directs the concentrated light of his mental vision upon his own life and works, and this creates an artificial dissociation between himself and the universal nature, within whose bosom he lies. So essentially, he's saying that in the city life, that there is a unnatural focus on the individual, as if an individual is wretched from the universal, and that is a false dichotomy, that there is no individual without the universal. But if you live and if you believe in this kind of fortress living, then that's the reality you'll know, and that's the only truth you'll ever believe. But in India, the point of view was different. It included the world with the man as one great truth. India put all her emphasis on the harmony that exists between the individual and the universal. She felt we could have no communication whatsoever with our surroundings if they were absolutely foreign to us. Man's complaint against nature is that he has to acquire most of his necessities by his own efforts. Yes, that is true, but those efforts are not in vain. He is reaping success every day, and that shows that there is a rational connection between him and nature. For we can never make anything of our own except that which is truly related to us. So this tells us two things. First is exactly what he said, that we can never make anything our own except that which is truly related to us. The fact that man is able to acquire his necessities from nature means that nature belongs to him. Not that nature is for him to control, but that they are in an interdependent relationship. And it also tells us that the complaint that man makes, oh, this is a very difficult task, it doesn't mean that it's a meaningless task. It means that it is full of meaning, that to be in communion with nature, to be constantly in to be conversing with nature, that task can never be meaningless, no matter how difficult it may be. We can look upon a road from two different points of view. So now he's trying to help us understand how the West and the East, as in like ancient India, how we look upon how we look upon our relationship with nature, and how there are two very different ways of looking at it. We can look upon a road from two different points of view. One regards it as dividing us from the object of our desire. In that case, we count every step of our journey over it as something attained by force in the face of obstruction. The other sees it as a road which leads us to our destination, and as such is a part of our goal. So then he's saying that there are two ways of looking at it. One is ki we have to wrench something away by force from this kind of enemy. Like it views the world with animosity, that everybody is out to get us, and whatever we get is we need to fight for it. And without fighting, without almost like without theft, there can be no gain. And the whole idea of gaining and losing and reaching a goal, do you understand the kind of terminology and the kind of language that goes into this kind of worldview? And then now now I'm gonna contrast it to the ancient Indian worldview. The other sees it as a road which leads us to the destination, and as such is part of our goal. It is already the beginning of our entertainment of our attainment, and by journeying over it we can only gain that which in itself it offers to us. So again, the song by Miley Cyrus, it ain't about how fast I get there, ain't about what's waiting on the other side, it's the climb. So again, this is the second way of looking at life. This last point of view is that of India with regard to nature. For her, the great fact is that we are in harmony with nature, that man can think because his thoughts are in harmony with things, that he can use the forces of nature for his own purpose only because his power is in harmony with the power which is universal, not that it lies above and beyond it. And that in the long run, his purpose never can knock against the purpose which works through nature. In the West, the prevalent feeling is that nature belongs exclusively to inanimate things and to beasts, and that there is a sudden unaccountable break where human nature begins. According to it, everything that is low in the scale of beings is merely nature, and whatever has a stamp of perfection on it, intellectual or moral, is human nature. It is like dividing the bud and the blossom into separate categories and putting their grace to the credit of two different and antithetical principles. But the Indian mind never has any hesitation in acknowledging its kinship with nature, its unbroken relationship with the all. So again, like I said before, that anything that's brutish, that is bestial, that is basic, that is uncivilized, unsophisticated, is not a part of nature, and anything that is not all of these things is nature, and not just nature but human nature. So there is a kind of like superiority that is attributed to human beings as though they lie above and beyond nature, as if they have the power to control nature, while ancient India would say that there is nothing you can control that is not allowing you to control it, that there is nothing that is yours except there is nothing that you acquire which isn't already yours. The fundamental unity of creation was not simply a philosophical speculation for India. It was her life object to realize this great harmony in feeling and in action. With meditation and service, with the regulation of life, she cultivated her consciousness in such a way that everything had a spiritual meaning to her. The earth, water and light, fruits and flowers, to her were not merely physical phenomena to be turned to use and then left aside. They were necessary to her in the attainment of her ideal of perfection, as every note is necessary to completeness of the symphony. India intuitively felt that the essential fact of this world has a vital meaning for us. We have to be fully alive to it and establish a conscious relation with it, not merely impelled by scientific curiosity or greed of average advantage, of material advantage, but realizing it in the spirit of sympathy with a large feeling of joy and peace. And I would really like you to listen to the kind of language he's using, language like intuitively, and the words like sympathy and joy and peace and meaning and the idea of spirituality, unity of creation. It's not just a speculation, it's not just a philosophical speculation. So he's trying to say that the belief system that that ancient philosophers carried, it wasn't simply an intellectual activity. It was like something they lived. It wasn't just something they preached. The man of science knows in one aspect that the world is not merely what it appears to be to our senses. He knows that earth and water are really the play of forces and that manifest themselves to us as earth and water, how we can but partially apprehend. Likewise, the man who has his spiritual eye open knows that the ultimate truth about earth and water lies in our apprehension of the eternal will, which works in time and takes shape in the forces we realize under those aspects. This is not mere knowledge as science is, but it is the perception of the soul by the soul. So he's trying to explain to us how truth cannot be attained through knowledge, because knowledge has a connotation of accumulation, that if I just read 10 books, I will know what it is. He's trying to say that if you want to know what the truth is, you have to realize it through life, and no amount of logic or rationality will get you any closer to it. It really is your intuition. It's when you get closer and closer to your truest self that you get closer and closer to the universe, and the eternal. And in that realization, in that connection, when you understand that you are a part of everything and everything is a part of you, that's when you'll realize what truth is. This does not lead us to power as knowledge does, but it gives us joy, which is the product of union of kindred things. So, they say, right, the ignorance is bliss and knowledge is sorrow. So this is why he says it gives us joy, which knowledge would never, because the more you know, the sadder you get. But the more you feel and the more you are just in the present moment, just feeling. There is no need to be sad. There is only infinite love and joy. The man whose acquaintance with the world does not lead him deeper than science leads him will never understand what it is that the man with the spiritual vision finds in these natural phenomena. The water does not merely cleanse his limbs, but it purifies his heart, for it touches his soul. The earth does not merely hold his body, but it gladdens his mind, for its contact is more than a physical contact. It's a living presence. When a man does not realize his kinship with the world, he lives in a prison house whose walls are alien to him. When he meets the eternal spirit in all objects, then he is emancipated. For then he discovers the fullest significance of the world into which he is born. Then he finds himself in perfect truth, and his harmony with the all is established. In India, men are enjoined to be fully awake to the fact that they are in the closest relationship to things around them, body and soul, and that they are to hail the morning sun, the flowing water, the fruitful earth, as the manifestation of the same living truth which holds them in its embrace. Thus, the text of our everyday meditation is the Gayatri, a verse which is considered to be the epitome of all the Vedas. By its help, we try to realize the essential unity of the world with the conscious soul of the man. We learn to perceive the unity held together by the one eternal spirit, whose power creates the earth, the sky, and the stars, and at the same time irradiates our minds with the light of consciousness that moves and exists in unbroken continuity with the outer world. It is not true that India has tried to ignore differences of value in different things, for she knows that that would make life impossible. The sense of superiority of man and the scale of creation has not been absent, but she has had her own idea as to which his superiority really consists. And it is not in the power of possession, but in the power of union. This is exactly what I was saying before, that we understand that yes, man has infinite potential, but his potential must not be used to plunder and conquer, but it is to be in union. Therefore, India chose her place of pilgrimage wherever there was in nature some special grandeur or beauty, so that her mind could come out of its world of narrow necessities and realize its place in the infinite. This was the reason why in India, a whole people who were once meat eaters gave up taking animal food to cultivate the sentiment of universal sympathy for life, an event unique in the history of mankind. I think he means Jains, right? India knew that when by physical and mental barriers we violently detach ourselves from the inexhaustible life of nature, when we become merely man, but not man in the universe. So merely man is to succumb to our most basic, hedonistic almost desires. And man in the universe is our highest, most enlightened being. So when we become merely man, but not man in the universe, we create bewildering problems, and having shut off the source of their solution, we try all kinds of artificial methods, each of which brings up its own crop of interminable difficulties. When man leaves his resting place in the universal nature, when he walks on a single rope of humanity, it means either a dance or a fall for him. He has ceaselessly to strain every nerve and muscle to keep his balance at each step. And then, in the intervals of his weariness, he fulminates against Providence and feels a secret pride and satisfaction in thinking that he has been unfairly dealt with by the whole scheme of things. Which is essentially to say that as soon as man realizes that he's been fucked because of his atheism, he almost revels in in his victimhood. Which is also to say that it is almost too easy to be an atheist and it's very difficult to be a believer. But then he also says that this cannot go on forever. Man must realize the wholeness of his existence, his place in the infinite. He must know that hard as he may strive, he can never create his honey within the cells of his hive, for the perennial supply of his food lies outside his walls. He must know that when man shuts himself out from the vitalizing and purifying touch of the infinite and falls back upon himself for his sustenance and his healing, then he goads himself into madness, tears himself into shreds, and eats his own substance. Essentially, nihilism. But then that's what he's saying, that if you're not a believer, then you're an atheist, and eventually that will lead to nihilism. But then he's also saying that you cannot be that forever. Eventually you will find God, because God is everywhere. And that's why he believes that there is no such thing as ultimate evil, absolute evil, because everything does eventually find its way to life, joy and love. That evil and fear and disbelief and all of these negative qualities, they don't have enough strength to last as long as joy and love and creation does. Deprived of the background of the whole, his poverty loses its one great quality, which is simplicity, and becomes squalid and shamefaced. His wealth is no longer magnanimous, it grows merely extravagant. So now he's saying that as soon as man detaches himself from the universe, as soon as his life loses meaning, whatever he has acquired, it takes on a cheap meaning, which is why he says that his poverty loses its one great quality, which is simplicity. Now he's no longer poor, he's no longer austere and simple, it's squalid and shamefaced. His wealth is not magnanimous, it grows merely extravagant. His appetites do not minister to his life, keeping to the limits of their purpose. They become an end in themselves and set fire to his life and play the fiddle in the lurid life of conflagration. Then it is that in our self-expression we try to startle and not to attract. In art we strive for originality and lose sight of the truth, which is old and yet ever new. In literature, we miss the complete view of man, which is simple and yet great, but he appears as a psychological problem or the embodiment of a fashion, which is intense because abnormal. But he appears as a psychological problem or the embodiment of a passion that is intense, because abnormal and because exhibited in the glare of a fiercely emphatic light, which is artificial. So essentially he's saying that as soon as you fall back to your ego, as soon as you fall back to your most basic, most the lowest level of your nature, everything about you becomes, it loses light, which is why he says our self-expression becomes we try to startle and not attract. Startle is like you want to shock, it's for effect. Attraction, don't think of attraction as like a kind of a ornamental attraction, but think of it in terms of like attraction and manifestation, the law of attraction, as in we don't try to, there is not enough communication between you and the world. There is simply you trying to give or take from the world. It's not equal, it's somehow imbalanced. When a man's consciousness is restricted only to the immediate vicinity of his human self, the deeper roots of his nature do not find their permanent soil. His spirit is ever on the brink of starvation, and in the place of a healthful strength, he substitutes rounds of stimulation. Then it is that man, missing his inner perspective and measures his greatness by its bulk and not by its vital link with the infinite, judges his activity by its movement and not by the repose of perfection, the repose which is in the starry heavens and the ever-flowing rhythmic dance of creation. So now he's saying that this kind of man will look at life as as a linear progress, not as a cyclical model of creation and destruction, which is why he's saying that he judges his activity by its mere movement. It is not enough to say that I picked up pen and paper and wrote 5 words. It is to say that if I wrote 5 words, I wrote them from, I meant them. They were honest words, that I may not have done a lot, but what I did was meaningful. It was true. It was, so that's what he's saying, that as soon as you start, as soon as you fall back into your ego, your worldview becomes purely sensual, it becomes purely physical, it completely loses sight of the spiritual, of the eternal, and it becomes empty, nihilistic, fearful, and sort of you end up self-sabotaging. You lose sight of what's good for you. The first invasion of India has its exact parallel in the invasion of America by the European settlers. They also were confronted with primeval forests and a fierce struggle with the aboriginal races. But this struggle between man and nature lasted till the very end. They never came to any terms. In India, the forests, which were the habitation of the barbarians, became the sanctuary of sages. But in America, these great living cathedrals of nature has no deeper significance to man. They brought him wealth and power, and perhaps at times they administrated his enjoyment of beauty and inspired a solitary poet, but they never acquired a sacred association in the hearts of men as the site of some great spiritual reconciliation where man's soul has its meeting place with the soul of the world. So he's essentially saying that although yes, America, that there were a few people who were inspired by the beauty of nature, but at large, nature only had an ornamental value to the, not just America, but I think he just means to say invaders, colonizers, conquerors, those who want to dominate a person, a city, a country, anything. Who feel like they have some right over resources, who have the right to force people to give up something because they believe that they have some divine right or some kind of, So that's what he's saying, that they may have brought him wealth and power, but they never gave him the kind of, they never gave him the great spiritual reconciliation, because if nature was never seen, it was never revered as such, was never treated as such. And that's the difference between how India and the West view nature. So now Tagore will talk about how, so now Tagore says, I don't wish for a moment to suggest that these things should have been otherwise. It would be an utter waste of opportunities if history were to repeat itself exactly in the same manner in every place. It is best for the commerce of the spirit that people differently situated should bring their different products into the market of humanity, each of which is complementary and necessary to the others. So all I wish to say is that India, so what he means to say is that I don't wish that things were different. It is best if different thoughts and ways of living come together and come in contact with one another. But he just wants to sort of lay down the foundation of where we derive our values. Ancient India, what kind of values have we held from time immemorial? So he says, all that I wish to say is that India, at the outset of her career, met with a special combination of circumstances which were not lost upon her. She had, according to her opportunities, thought and pondered, striven and suffered, dived into the depths of existence, and achieved something which surely cannot be without its value to people, whose evolution in history took a different way altogether. So he's saying even as people took a different route, even if they chose to believe differently, it doesn't mean that they don't see value in the way we chose to live out our lives in ancient India. Man, for his perfect growth, requires all the living elements that constitute his perfect life. That is why his food has to be cultivated in different fields and brought from different sources. So he's sort of making an argument for diversity, that even as we disagree, there must be space for different kinds of thought. Civilization is a kind of mold that each nation is busy making for itself to shape its men and women according to its best ideal. All its institutions, its legislature, its standard of approbation and condemnation, its conscious and unconscious teachings tend toward that object. So he's trying to describe the universal meaning of civilization, what all civilizations try to do. And now after that, he'll try to strike a difference between modern and Indian civilization. Not Indian, just ancient India. So, the modern civilization of the West, by all its organized efforts, is trying to turn out men perfect in physical, intellectual, and moral efficiency. And please do think about what perfect means and who decides what perfect is. There, the vast energies of the nations are employed in extending man's power over his surroundings, and people are combining and straining every faculty to possess and to turn to account all that they can lay their hands upon, to overcome every obstacle on their path of conquest. They are ever disciplining themselves to fight nature and other races. Their armaments are getting more and more stupendous every day. Their machines, their appliances, their organizations go on multiplying at an amazing rate. This is a splendid achievement, no doubt, and a wonderful manifestation of man's masterfulness, which knows no obstacle and which has for its object the supremacy of himself over everything else. So he's making an argument for human possibilities, human capabilities, which are indeed limitless, as we can see in the model world. But he's also like contrasting it to how ancient India, where ancient India finds value, which part of man does ancient India places value in. The ancient Indian civilization, on the other hand, had its own ideal of perfection, towards which its efforts were directed. Its aim was not to attain power, and it neglected to cultivate to the utmost of its capacities and to organize men for defensive and offensive purposes. But it was focused on cooperation. No, and it neglected to cultivate to the utmost of its capacities and to organize men for defensive and offensive purposes, for cooperation in the acquisition of wealth, and for military and political ascendancy. So he's essentially saying that we never wanted to create a society where a progressive society, a society that's forward looking, a society that a competitive society. The ideal that India tried to realize led her best men to the isolation of a contemplative life, and the treasures that she gained for mankind by penetrating into the mysteries of reality cost her dear in the sphere of worldly success. So he's saying that ancient India was never focused on ambition, rather it was more focused on satisfaction, or contentment is a better word, on some kind of inner something inside you that just says bus. Kafi hai. There's this quote, right? Which I don't know who said this, but there's this whole anecdote of this man saying something like, the rich man has like what is it that the rich man has? What is it that the poor man has that the rich man doesn't? And so this person responds by saying, the poor man has enough. So that's exactly the kind of attitude, the kind of worldview that ancient India wanted to cultivate in its great men. Yet this was also a sublime achievement. It was a supreme manifestation of that human aspiration which knows no limit and which has for its object nothing less than the realization of the infinite. To be able to find God, that in itself was ancient India's greatest achievement. There were the virtuous, the wise, the courageous. There were the statesmen, kings, and emperors of India. But whom amongst all these classes did she look up to and choose to be the representative of men? They were the rishis. And what were the rishis? They who having attained the supreme soul in knowledge, were filled with wisdom, and having found in union with the soul, were in perfect harmony with the inner self. They, having realized him in the heart, were free from all selfish desires, and having experienced him in all activities of the world, had attained calmness. The rishis were they who, having reached the supreme God from all sides, had found abiding peace, had become united with the all, had entered into the life of the universe. Thus, the state of realizing our relationship with all, of entering into everything through the union with God, was considered in India to be the ultimate end and fulfillment of humanity. So essentially, in India, greatness was not defined by worldly success, by how much you possess and accumulate, but in having a soul, and in having a soul that's connected to all other souls, all other kind of sentient souls, whether it's other men or animals or plants, or the skies or the flowers. Flowers are plants. Man can destroy and plunder, earn and accumulate, invent and discover, but he is great because his soul comprehends all. It is dire destruction for him when he envelops his soul in a dead shell of callous habits, when a blind fury of works whirls around him like an eddying dust storm, shutting out the horizon. That indeed kills the very spirit of his being, which is the spirit of comprehension. Essentially, man is a slave. Sorry. Essentially, man is not a slave, either of himself or of the world, but he's a lover. His freedom and his fulfillment is in love, which is another name for perfect comprehension. By this power of comprehension, this permeation of his being, he is united with the all-pervading spirit, who is also the breath of his soul. Where a man tries to raise himself to eminence by pushing and jostling all others to achieve a distinction by which he prides himself to be more than anybody else, there he is alienated from that spirit. This is why the Upanishads describe those who have attained the goal of human life as peaceful and as at one with God, meaning that they are in perfect harmony with man and nature, and therefore in undistributed union with God. So here he essentially talks about how man is free and he is only free in love. And again, I would like you all to go back to my previous videos. One is the video on the self, Tagore on self, and the second was Tagore on love, because here he talks about, he hints at both those, he hints at things, he goes into depth in those two chapters. So here he says that the only way he is free, and he is born free, is in love. And then he also says that love is another name for comprehension. And again, I have said this before in the first part of this video, that there is a difference between knowledge and comprehension, because knowledge is power, knowledge is sorrow, knowledge is accumulation, knowledge is possession, knowledge has no end, knowledge will make you greedy, it will make you feel less, because there will always be so much more left to read, left to know, left to understand. However, comprehension is way more, it's humble. Comprehension laughs at itself. Comprehension understands that, yeah, I mean, I know these 5-6 things, but there are these 5-6 things I don't know, and then there are unlimited things that I don't know. And it feels okay with not knowing. So, which is why he is free. Man in perfect comprehension is free. Man in love is free. Man in knowledge, man seeking knowledge, he would never be free. He would always be asking for more. If anybody of you have read Dr. Faustus by, what was his name? Forget it. Dr. Faustus, he had an unquenchable thirst for ambition, for knowledge, and eventually he sold his soul to the devil to get in order to acquire unlimited knowledge, and he was miserable. Eventually he wanted to take back the vow he made to Satan, but it was too late. So when man attempts to make possession itself his goal, he will find himself in utter despair and sorrow. He will find himself in the deepest, darkest depths of hell. But when man lets go of any tangible outcome, and when his act becomes selfless and disinterested, which is to say that it is done for its own sake, that's when he finds joy in the act itself. And these are the people who find joy in learning. These are not the people who will boast about or brag about all these books they've read, all these authors they know. They'll be like, oh yeah, I know this thing, and also that's the part I don't understand. I would be happy to hear other people enlighten me on that. There will be joy in learning. There will be joy in disseminating the knowledge that you have acquired. There will be joy in a kind of there will be a kind of harmony. There won't be competition, if that makes sense, right? Yeah, that makes sense to me. We have a glimpse of the same truth in the teachings of Jesus when he says, it is easier for, this is brilliant, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I'll repeat that. He says, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. which implies that whatever we treasure for ourselves separates us from others. Our possessions are our limitations. He who is bent upon accumulating riches is unable, with his ego continually bulging, to pass through the gates of comprehension of the spiritual world, which is the world of perfect harmony. He is shut up within the narrow walls of his limited acquisitions. He is lost. Hence, the spirit of the teachings of Upanishads is, in order to find him, you must embrace all. In the pursuit of wealth, you really give up everything to gain a few things, and that is not the way to attain him who is completeness. Some modern philosophers of Europe, who are directly or indirectly indebted to the Upanishads, far from realizing their debt, maintain that the Brahma of India is a mere abstraction, a negation of all that is in the world. In a word, that is, the infinite being is to be found nowhere except in metaphysics. It may be that such a doctrine has been and still is prevalent with a section of our countrymen, but this is certainly not in accord with the pervading spirit of the Indian mind. Instead, it is the practice of realizing and reaffirming the presence of the infinite in all things which has been its constant inspiration. He's basically talking about modern philosophers who believe that the Brahma means the universe, is an abstraction, and they kind of reduce it to metaphysics. They reduce it to a kind of formulae. They reduce it to the physical world. They reduce something irreducible in the name of science, because science is all powerful. And essentially he's saying that they are indebted to the Upanishads, but instead of realizing that they are indebted in that way, they choose to negate it, which is to say you're using the knowledge of Upanishads to upturn it, and you're also doing it with the knowledge of the Upanishads. So then Tagore goes on to say, we are enjoined to see that whatever there is in the world as being enveloped by God. I bow to God over and over again, who is in fire and in water, who permeates the whole world, who is in the annual crops as well as in the perennial trees. Now, this is something the intellectual mind, the scientific mind won't understand, because for them, God is a concept. For them, God is an idea. For them, God is not a feeling. For them, God is not an experience. If there is no experiment that can prove God or disprove God, then such words are mere abstractions. Such words are vague platitudes. They are seen with scorn. If they are not present in the physical world, if they cannot be proved, if they cannot be tangibly accessed, if they cannot be... I hope you're understanding where I'm going. Essentially, that science will never understand what the truth that the spirit holds, and which is why he says that we are enjoined to see that whatever there is in the world as being enveloped by God, that this is what ancient India has believed, does believe, and will continue to believe. Then he asks, can this God be abstracted from the world? Instead, it signifies not merely seeing him in all things, but saluting him in all objects of the world. So he's saying it's not merely to find God, but to revere God. The attitude of the God-conscious man of the Upanishad towards the universe is one of deep feeling of adoration. His object of worship is present everywhere. It is the one living truth that makes all realities true. This truth is not only of knowledge but of devotion. Namo Namah, we bow down to him everywhere and over again. It is recognized in the outburst of the Rishi, who addresses the whole world in a sudden ecstasy of joy. Listen to me, ye sons of the immortal spirit, ye who live in the heavenly abode. I have known the Supreme Person whose light shines forth from beyond the darkness. Do we not find the overwhelming delight of a direct and positive experience where there is not the least trace of vagueness of passivity? So exactly what he's saying, that if there is somebody who is narrating an experience with God, is there no positivity felt in enjoying that experience with him? Buddha, who developed the practical side of the teaching of the Upanishads, preached the same message when he said, "With everything, whether it is above or below, or remote or near, visible or invisible, thou shalt preserve a relation of unlimited love, without any animosity or without a desire to kill. To live in such a consciousness while standing or walking, sitting or lying down till you are asleep is Brahma Vihara, or in other words, is living and moving and having your joy in the spirit of Brahma." I think I should repeat this. Buddha, who developed the practical side of the teaching of the Upanishads, preached the same message when he said, "With everything, whether it is above or below, remote or near, visible or invisible, thou shalt preserve a relation of unlimited love without any animosity or without a desire to kill. To live in such a consciousness while standing or walking, sitting or lying down, till you are asleep is Brahma Vihara, or in other words, is living and moving and having your joy in the spirit of Brahma." What is that spirit? The Upanishad says. The being who in his essence, the light and life of all, who is world conscious, is Brahma. To feel all, to be conscious of everything, is his spirit. We are immersed in his consciousness, body and soul. It is through his consciousness that the sun attracts the earth. It is through his consciousness that the light waves are being transmitted from planet to planet. Not only in space, but this light and life, this all-feeling being is in all our souls. He is all conscious in space or the world of extension, and he is all conscious in soul or the world of intention. How beautiful is that? Thus, to attain our world consciousness, we have to unite our feeling with this all-pervasive feeling of infinite. In fact, the only true progress is coincident with this widening of the range of feeling. All our poetry, philosophy, science, art, and religion are serving to extend the scope of our consciousness towards higher and larger spheres. Man does not acquire rights through occupation of larger space, nor through external conduct, but his rights extend only so far as he is real, and his reality is measured by the scope of his consciousness. Which is to say that if you can only feel the physical world, then that is your reality, that is the extent of your consciousness. But if you can look beyond the Maya, you can look beyond the illusion, if you can feel the truth inside your gut, that's true progress, and it's not linear, it's internal and cyclical. We have, however, to pay a price for this attainment of the freedom of consciousness. Of course, nothing comes free of cost. But then what is this price? It is to give oneself away. Our soul can realize itself truly only by denying itself. The Upanishad says, "Thou shalt gain by giving away, thou shalt not covet." In Gita, we are advised to work disinterestedly, abandoning all lust for the result. Many outsiders conclude from this teaching that the conception of the world as something unreal lies at the root of the so-called disinterestedness preached in India, but the reverse is true. The man who aims at his own aggrandizement underrates everything else. Please think about Ayn Rand here. Thus, in order to be fully conscious of the reality of all, one has to be free himself from the bonds of personal desires. This discipline we have to go through to prepare ourselves for our social duties, for sharing the burdens of our fellow human beings. Every endeavor to attain a larger life requires of man to gain by giving away and not to be greedy, and thus to expand gradually the consciousness of one's unity with all other striving of humanity. So he's saying that if you want to be the highest and your best self, you have to look beyond yourself. You have to expand yourself. Okay, I'm gonna quote Dr. Kenvin Smith, who was my teacher at Young India Fellowship, who said something like, so he was talking about knowledge, and how he cannot know, if there is anything he knows for sure, it is that he loves and that he is loved, and that love only grows by giving it away. And that's exactly what Tagore here is saying. It's beautiful. The infinite in India was not a thin non-entity void of all content. The rishis of India asserted emphatically, to know him in this life is to be true. Not to know him in this life is a desolation of death. You're a living dead. How do you know him then? By realizing him in each and all, by not separating yourself from anything outside you, by understanding that we're all one and we're all in this together. not only in nature but in the family, in society, and in the state. The more we realize the world conscious is all in all, the better for us. Failing to realize it, we turn our faces to destruction, to nihilism. It fills me with great joy and a high hope for the future of humanity when I realize that there was a time in the remote past when our poet prophets stood under the lavish sunshine of an ancient India, or of an Indian sky, and greeted the world with the glad recognition of the kindred. It is not an anthropomorphic hallucination. It is not seeing man reflected everywhere in a grotesquely exaggerated image and witnessing the human drama acted on a gigantic scale in nature's arena of flitting lights and shadows. On the contrary, it means crossing the limiting barriers of the individual, to become more than man, to become one with the all. It is not a mere play of the imagination, but it was the liberation of consciousness from all mystifications and exaggerations of the self. These ancient seers felt in the serene depth of their mind that the same energy which vibrates and passes into the endless forms of the world manifests itself into our inner being as consciousness, and that there is no break in unity. For these seers, there was no gap in their luminous vision of perfection. They never acknowledged even death itself as creating a chasm in the field of reality. Like I've said before, that death is but another step in life, that it's a part of life, it's not a break from life. It is life that is death. They saluted with the same serenity of gladness. Also, it is life that is death. If anybody remembers my Panikkar video, remember there was this part where Panikkar says, where he quotes, I'm not sure who he quotes, but he says that he quotes a conversation, and in which one person asks the other, what could be worse than hell? And the other person replies that there was no hell. Which is to say that hell exists for a purpose. Hell exists to balance out the forces of life, and hell is not the opposite of life. Life is it is life that is death. It's a cycle. It's a cycle of death and creation and destruction. We must not see it as an end. We must see it as a part of a new beginning. They saluted with the same serenity of gladness life in its aspect of appearing and its aspect of departure. Life in its aspect of appearing and in its aspect of departure. That which is past is hidden in life, and that which is to come. Exactly, the past is never over. They knew that the mere appearance and disappearance are merely on the surface like the waves on the sea, but life, which is permanent, knows no decay or diminution. And I have mentioned this in one of my earlier Tagore videos, where there's this very beautiful line where Tagore says that life dances upon death, that death can never take on life, that which is why there is no absolute evil, which is why we must not fear death, which is why we must understand it as a small part of life. Everything has sprung from immortal life and is vibrating with life, for life is immense. This is the noble heritage from our forefathers, waiting to be claimed by us as our own. This ideal of supreme freedom of consciousness. It is not merely intellectual or emotional, it is an ethical basis, and it must be translated into action. In the Upanishad, it is said, the Supreme Being is all-pervading, therefore, He is the innate good in all. That which exists everywhere cannot be bad, it must be good. And it must be our deepest, truest, our best self. To be truly united in knowledge, love, and service with all beings, and thus to realize oneself in the all-pervading God, is the essence of goodness. And this is the keynote of the teachings of the Upanishads. Life is immense. So that's the end of this chapter. I find this chapter to be very profound and beautiful. I find sadhana to be very profound and beautiful. And there are 3 more chapters left to do, and I'll do them sometime later. But for the time being, I'm done with sadhana. I will be doing next a conversation between Einstein and Tagore, which will begin as a contention between science and faith, and ultimately maybe we'll learn something new. I don't know. I don't want to give anything away.